Coming up now on Michael Corrin, a very controversial book, The Holocaust Industry, a controversial man, Norman Finkelstein. Join me over there, please. Hello, good evening, and welcome to Michael Corrin Live. Now, I promoted this last night as being a very controversial show, and I don't think that is redundant language, or I don't think I'm being hysterical either. Everything is meant to be controversial today. Generally, it isn't. But there are certain issues and certain subjects where debate can be difficult. This book is The Holocaust Industry, and Norman Finkelstein is the author. He's written other books too. I suppose this is the central thesis, and it has got him into all sorts of trouble and also won him many fans and supporters. Some of them he probably actually wouldn't want to have, but we'll get to that a bit later. The lines will be very busy indeed. Every time we touch issues that concern the Middle East or Jewish people, I say this, and generally it's a forlorn hope, but if you really are a racist, a bigot, and a hater, it ain't the station for you. Go somewhere else. I will give you very little time, if any. Intelligent, open, free debate and discussion is what we're looking for. Hatred, just won't tolerate it. Okay? The toll-free number, remember, we have that now, 1-866-956-5555. The other number is 416-203-0302 and 905-332-3131. Welcome to you, sir.
Thank you for having me.
Controversial, I can't not use the word. It's been overused and it's hackneyed, but you are extremely controversial. Why is that?
Well, I think I say things in the book which many people have said in private, within and outside the Jewish community, but which hasn't been publicly said. And I was the first person, I think, to publicly say what many people were privately saying. That, I think, is the main source of the controversy, because I don't actually think my findings are particularly controversial. What I have to say is not really shocking. What's shocking is that it's being said in public.
What is it? What's the central thesis of your book?
Well, basically, the central thesis of the book is that American Jewish organizations have exploited the Nazi Holocaust for political and financial gain.
Mm-hmm. Go on.
Basically, the Holocaust was first used by American Jewish organizations as an ideological weapon to deflect criticism of Israel. And in more recent years, it's basically turned into an extortion racket, a shakedown, where the colossal suffering of the Jewish people is being exploited by Jewish organizations to extract, mostly on false pretenses, what's called Holocaust compensation monies from European governments. And once the monies are extracted, extorted is the accurate word, once the monies are extorted from these governments, in fact, the actual survivors never see any of the monies. So as I point out in the last chapter of my book, it's a double shakedown. It's a shakedown of the European governments on whom demands are made for which there's no evidence to support those demands. And once the monies are being extracted, extorted, then the actual survivors are being shaken down.
So you're saying there's been an exploitation of the Holocaust?
Yes, there's been a consistent political exploitation of the Holocaust to deflect criticisms of legitimate criticism of Israel's crimes against the Palestinians. And now there's exploitation which has reduced the colossal suffering of the Jewish people during World War II, has reduced that suffering to the moral stature of a Monte Carlo casino. And that's deeply offensive, besides being immoral.
I respect strong, firm history. Using a term like Monte Carlo casino, is that the language of a serious historian?
Well, the question...
Or someone who is perhaps trying to exploit the Holocaust?
Well, the question is whether the language is an apt description of what's going on. If it's an apt description, the language is appropriate. If it's an inapt description, the language is inappropriate. I think let's leave me aside for the moment. Let's take the world's greatest authority in the Nazi Holocaust. Nobody will dispute that the greatest living authority by a wide margin is Raoul Hilberg, the author of the classical study, The Destruction of the European Jews. there isn't even any scholar who even remotely approaches him in scholarly or moral authority. Now, way before I came along, way before Norman Finkelstein came along, Raoul Hilberg was saying over and over again that American Jewry, that's his term, American Jewry was extorting and blackmailing money from Switzerland. Now, I ask you, is using terms like extortion and blackmail, is that the language of a historian? Well, if it's not, then you're telling me, or you're disqualifying Raoul Hilberg from consideration as a historian.
What you've done, which is also, I think, and I'm not much of a historian, I mean, my degree and my postgraduate work is in history, but certainly there's a major, fundamental and profound difference between using words like extortion, which are certainly within the vocabulary, and comparing something that concerns the death of millions of people to a fun time in a resort in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Well, when I say a Monte Carlo casino, I say it's reduced the suffering of the Jewish people, which I take very seriously. Mm-hmm. I know I'm sometimes accused nowadays of exploiting the suffering of my parents, but
your parents were in death camps.
My parents were in the Warsaw Ghetto from September 1939 to May 1943. My father was then taken to Auschwitz concentration camp. My mother was in Majdanek concentration camp, and they were there through the duration of the war. On both sides of my family, every single member was exterminated. I never had an aunt, I never had an uncle, I never had a grandparent. I didn't even have a concept of relatives. And nobody, I think, who knows me will deny that I was deeply invested in my parents' well-being and in their memory. And I think it is deeply offensive when organizations like the World Jewish Congress, the Jewish Claims Conference, when they use that suffering in order to extract monies, when they parade Holocaust survivors in front of cameras to extract monies, and then, after extracting the money, extorting the money, blackmailing the money, and then to inflict a new suffering on the survivors by denying them any of the monies that they have gotten. I mean, it's very difficult, it really is very difficult to conceive of any lower tactic than the one these organizations have engaged in.
I've met survivors. I've met two various types of survivors. I've met survivors who have received money. I've also met survivors who've been offered money and said, no, I don't think it would be appropriate for me to have any money from this. I'd rather it went back to you to fight anti-Semitism and to fight for causes for the Jewish people. But you're saying that absolutely no survivor of a death camp ever got any money from these Jewish organizations?
No, I'm not saying that, oh yeah, from the Jewish organizations. Let me just give you an example from my own family, and I can assure you, and I can supply ample documentation, it's not at all atypical of what happened. My late father, he incurred a very serious injury to his skull in Auschwitz, and he received quite a substantial pension from Germany. Relatively speaking, you can never say, what would be adequate compensation. Sure. But by the end of his life, he was receiving approximately $600 a month from Germany, and it would have come, all told, for his entire life, it would have come to about $250,000. He never, even though he loathed Germans, as did my mother, never discriminated between good Germans and bad Germans, Nazis and Germans. He hated them all.
Hardly surprising. I don't think we can expect total correctness.
I never faulted him, and I never argued the point. I think it would have been audacious of me to try to even argue the point. I never bothered to. On the other hand, he never, ever uttered a single word of anger about the issue of the compensation. He was actually, quite satisfied. After all, as I'm sure you know, very seldom do victims of war ever receive compensation, and very seldom from the side that inflicted the wounds. On the other side, my late mother, for reasons which are a little bit too complicated to get into on this program, she did not receive compensation from the German government, but the German government provided what was called and still is the Jewish Claims Conference, with a huge sum of money, which was supposed to be used to compensate the survivors. In fact, all my mother received was $3,000 from Germany. She never received a dime from the Jewish organization. He never, even though he loathed Germans, as did my mother, never discriminated between good Germans and bad Germans, Nazis and Germans. He hated them all.
Hardly surprising. I don't think we can expect political correctness.
I never faulted him, and I never argued the point. I think it would have been audacious of me to try to even argue the point. I never bothered to. On the other hand, he never, ever uttered a single word of anger about the issue of the compensation. He was actually, you know, quite satisfied. After all, as I'm sure you know, very seldom do victims of war ever receive compensation, and very seldom from the side that inflicted the wounds. On the other side, my late mother, for reasons which are a little bit too complicated to get into on this program, she did not receive compensation from the German government, but the German government provided what was called and still is the Jewish Claims Conference, with a huge sum of money, which was supposed to be used to compensate the survivors. In fact, all my mother received was $3,000 from Germany. She never received a dime from the Jewish organization.
We're back. This is the book, The Holocaust Industry, Reflections on the Exploitation of Jewish Suffering. Norman Finkelstein is the author. He's written other books too. There is a central thesis to the other books, which is not dissimilar to that in this, which is that no denial of the Holocaust, but indeed the author's parents were in death camps, but there's been an exploitation, a political and monetary exploitation since then. Ideas have consequences. We're going to talk about your ideas at great length, but it must be troubling, to say the least, that any neo-Nazi website, any Holocaust denial website, they just love you. Oh, they adore you, because here's a Jew, and they can say, look what he says. And it surely must hurt the memory of your parents and you. Of course, an idea is an idea, and it doesn't matter if bad people exploit a bad or a good idea, but how do you deal with that you're constantly quoted by those who deny the Holocaust and actually would like to kill Jews if they could?
Well, let me just make a general answer, and then I'll get to the specific one of the Holocaust deniers. The general answer is that my book, my little book, attempts to restore the actual record because I am concerned that the truth be preserved. I am concerned that the memory is not falsified and then open to Holocaust denial. The real Holocaust deniers are the Holocaust industry, not me, and I don't mean that as a kind of rhetorical trick to play, to spring on you.
Yeah, but the fact is but you're not answering the question. Okay. We can get to that later. The question was, how do you feel when, and then let's not pretend that people generally say, well, I was reading the Holocaust industry today. You are the darling of Jew haters, Holocaust deniers, and anti-Semites. I'll say again, I'm a relatively deep thinker. It doesn't mean the idea is wrong if bad people exploit it, but it must hurt you as a son of a survivor, as a Jew, that you're on every Holocaust deniers website and they use you as a weapon.
Politics makes for strange bedfellows, and it's deeply regrettable. On the other hand, for example, one of your homegrown Holocaust deniers, Mr. Zundel.
German, actually.
Right. Well, I think he resides in Canada.
No, he's in the States now, I think.
Oh, he's in the States.
Yeah, we lost him. Okay, you can't win them all.
When he was here, occasionally he would send me huge packages, and I noticed that the files he assembled included people like Raoul Hilberg. It included people like Abraham Foxman, the head of the Anti-Defamation League, because all of them had denounced for different reasons, but they had all denounced the Holocaust compensation racket. You can't always, determine who's going to make use of what you write. It's regrettable. I'm not happy about it, for sure. I'm uncomfortable with it, for sure. But basically, in any moral decision, life would be very easy. Life would be very easy if moral decisions only had consequences that you want. But that's just not the way life is. You know, in my city, when the telephone workers go out and strike, a senior citizen may die because he or she can't contact an ambulance. That's a moral consequence of a strike.
Yeah.
That's real. But then you have to weigh the consequences. Does that mean every civil worker has to give up the right to strike? I don't think so. And the same way...
I used to teach a bit of philosophy. That's a pretty strained analogy.
Why?
Because none of the moral, sociological, intellectual content is similar from one part of the analogy to the other.
No, the thing is, in moral decisions, there are always consequences which were unintended or undesirable.
Let's talk about morality and absolutes, because you criticize someone in particular, and I think you're right to, a historian who wrote that the Germans had a particular penchant or ability to hate and kill, and I actually reject that thesis. I also read a piece you wrote in the New Republic, I think it was recently, who I thought was hysterical. There are elements in what you say that are certainly worthy of consideration. But have you not lost any of the ambiguity or the ambivalence in your thesis? It seems that you had an idea and you gallop ahead and you gallop ahead, and some of the things you say, some of the terminology, did you refer to World Jewish Congress and Canadian Jewish Congress as hucksters and gangsters and thugs?
Hucksters, gangsters, thugs.
So I know some guys in the Canadian Jewish Congress, and we may agree or disagree. I don't see them as thugs and gangsters.
Well, maybe...
Couldn't you just say they were wrong?
No, I don't think this was a question of wrong. They were fully cognizant of what they were doing. They were fully knowledgeable that they were blackmailing the Swiss. There was no lack of knowledge on their part of what they were doing. They were not unknowledgeably hijacking the colossal suffering of the Jewish people in a shakedown racket. That was not done sleepwalking. They knew exactly what they were doing. Are you trying to suggest to me they are not aware that when every day the handful of surviving victims of the Nazi persecution are begging them for a health care plan? Are they not aware that they're denying these victims simply a health care plan from all the money they have accumulated?
What I'm saying,
according to their own estimate, they have accumulated approximately $14 billion, and they don't have money for a health care plan for survivors.
What I'm saying, I suppose, as someone who studied under, and you'll be aware of his name, A.J.P. Taylor, I'm sure you, G.R. Elton, Bindoff, as an historian, that with all due respect, you can take on a very difficult issue, and you can mold and shape and tear that issue, but none of those great men I studied under would use terms like gangster, thug, and huckster, and they could... Goodness me, I saw them destroy people intellectually, but they didn't have to sort of use that sort of language. And excuse if this is wrong, I apologize, but it's the language of the dockside bully rather than the intellectual and the historian.
Well, you know, I'm not here to defend a language. Honest people can disagree on those questions.
Yes.
And, you know, Professor Hilberg, if you've read his The Destruction of the European Jews, he doesn't have a single adjective in the book. He has no adverbs in the book. He has an extremely dry style. In my opinion, extremely effective, but it's devoid of any kind of rhetorical embellishments.
No adjective anywhere in the book?
If you read the book, you'll be very surprised.
No, I have read it, but I think you'll find there are adjectives there.
Not much. Not much.
I've never seen a book without an adjective.
Well, my point is, he's a serious historian.
Yeah,
he's able to look beyond the language and judge the content.
Yes.
And my question is, if we're serious, why aren't we judging the content of what I've written rather than get lost in what my opinion is a diversion to avoid the very ugly facts I reveal in the book? We can disagree about style. I do have to say, though...
Because, language and language is a tool. When one uses language, the only purpose of which is to destroy argument, it has to be an issue for us to debate. When you say you are a thug and a gangster, you're not saying, let's have open debate. You're saying, you're... You mustn't have an opinion. It's like someone who accuses someone of racism to silence an argument. You're intelligent, man. You can't say, I can call someone a thug and a gangster and encourage open debate. You're silencing them.
No, I don't think I've silenced them. I think the shoe is rather on the other foot.
You're here?
Well, I'm here, but I will assure you this is a very rare television appearance. And I've never...
You're going to be on counter-spirit. There's Paul Martin that got you the boot there because of that.
I've never been on the television in the United States, and I wasn't interviewed once on radio in the United States. My book wasn't even reviewed in the United States. However, let me return to your point.
Excuse me.
Okay.
Len, Judy, Erica, Donna, lots of other calls. We'll get to all of you when we come back in a couple of moments on Michael Curran Live. Watch the commercials and back to us. We're back on Michael Curran Live. We're talking about this book, The Holocaust Industry. It's a fairly small book, really, but dropped into the pond of political and moral debate. The ripples are being felt in many countries. Norman Finkelstein is someone, a Jewish man, whose parents were in the death camp. He's not a Holocaust denier. He knows it happened. He says there's been a moral and political and financial exploitation of the same. Let's get to the calls. Len is on line 9. Hi, Len.
Good evening, Michael.
Hi.
Mr. Finkelstein, I have read your book, and in that book you seek, in my opinion, to make a distinction between what you refer to as the uppercase and the lowercase Holocaust. The uppercase Holocaust is rooted in the realm of history, and in terms of Hilberg and others, seems really to hold your attention. But for the latter, in your book you consider it nothing better, and I quote, than the shelves upon shelves of schlock that now line libraries and bookstores. I have to admit, I'm puzzled by your position because fictionalized and semi-fictionalized accounts of the Holocaust, be it Mille 18 or The Wall or Sophie's Choice, are really no different than fictionalized accounts of the American Civil War or the Korean War or any other historical event. So that being the case, given your very clear contempt for people like Elie Wiesel, who you accuse of making the Holocaust unknowable through mystification, isn't it hypocritical of you to say, in essence, that the Holocaust is off-limits to imaginative approaches which can, in their own way, make the Holocaust more knowable? Where is the conspiracy in that?
Okay.
Well, I think you confuse what I wrote in the book. Nowhere do I say that fictional accounts of the Nazi Holocaust are illegitimate. Rather the contrary, I say I grew up reading Leon Uris's Mille 18. I grew up reading John Hershey's The Wall, and they had a significant impact on me. The distinction is not between fictional and non-fictional accounts. The distinction is between non-fictional history, which is useful and which you can learn from, the classic studies, not only by Hilberg, but people like Henry Friedlander, Saul Friedlander, and the list is quite long. And then there's the other kind of quote-unquote history, which is not history at all. It's just an ideological weapon pretending to be history. So just as you mentioned a moment ago, the book by Daniel Goldhagen called Hitler's Willing Executioners. That pretends to be history. It's replete with footnotes. It has the imprimatur of Harvard University, where Mr. Goldhagen then taught, but it wasn't history at all. It was simply an ideological weapon. Its main thesis was that all the Goyim, all the Gentiles, all the Christians, all the non-Jews, they want to kill the Jews. That's his basic thesis. That's not history.
We must have
That's
read different.
nonsense.
We must have read different books here, because I read that. I didn't get, and I disagree with him as a Christian of Jewish ancestry. I was deeply offended, as I mentioned to the piece he read. It was in New Republic, wasn't it?
Yes.
Almost the entire issue, and I thought it was childish. It was hysterical. I thought it lacked historical research. I disagree with the thesis of his earlier book, but he didn't say that. What he said was, if you look at modern German history, particularly looking at 19th century German rationalism and Nietzsche and the idea of killing God and relative morality, that the Germans were the obvious people who would have committed the Holocaust. Now, we can disagree with that, but to say he's not a serious historian, he is a fairly serious historian.
No, there is no... Look, I hate to be quoting Mr. Hilberg again, but his first reaction to Goldhagen's book was, quote, "This is worthless." Goldhagen's book says...
That's an opinion, that's fine.
It's an opinion of a renowned authority. You know, if Einstein said a particular theory of physics was worthless, it carries some weight.
You can't compare science with history. One is an opinion,
right,
one is objective fact.
We can't compare authorities in respective fields. Now, Mr. Goldhagen's thesis was that since the time of Martin Luther, for several hundred years, all the German people wanted to do was kill the Jews. They were straining at the bit to kill the Jews. Along came Hitler, he gave them the green light, and that explains the Nazi Holocaust. I'm sorry, that's not history.
Oh, he's wrong.
That's a comic book. But it was pawned as history. It was promoted as history, and it was a bestseller not only in the United States, but worldwide.
Did he call anyone gangsters or hoodlums, or did he talk about Monte Carlo casinos?
He didn't call anyone gangsters.
I just want to establish what his serious history was.
Yeah, he just said that all the German people for the past 400 years have been genocidal murderers. I don't think that's a particularly enlightened piece of history.
I think he was wrong. I just don't remember him saying that. I think it was a fundamental misreading of Martin Luther, as many historians have done. There was a different, I don't want to get into Lutheranism too deeply, but there was certainly a different Martin Luther. He thought that as soon as the Reformed faith came along, the Jewish people would embrace Christianity. When they didn't, he said some things that were deeply regrettable. But I think what the author did was to construe too much from historical examples. But he was wrong. He was a historian with whom we disagree. And I think he got way too much play and press, I agree. But with all due respect, sir, I mean, some of the language you use in here, you're the serious historian, nobody else is?
No, I never said, first of all, the book is subtitled Reflections on the Exploitation of Jewish Suffering. Yeah. It doesn't claim to be, and I don't claim it to be, a great piece of history. Rather the contrary, my book is not about history. I defer to the historians who are knowledgeable on the topic. My book is how political organizations, Jewish organizations, exploit the history. Now, if we're going to get back to the question of language, allow me to remind you, I teach political philosophy. And go back and read, for example, Rousseau's second discourse on inequality. Read Marx's Communist Manifesto. Read Tom Paine's Common Sense. Read Edmund Burke's Reflections on the French Revolution.
I've read all those.
Okay, look at the language there.
Yeah.
Look at the language there. That's an awful polemical language. You know, Marx talks about capitalism springing into the world with blood pouring from all of its body. He talks about the capitalist money bags. Mr. Rousseau just rants and raves against the modern world using very colorful language. But does that disqualify serious discussion of their ideas? I admit, my language is not the language of many historians. But if we're serious, let's discuss the content.
Okay.
Were the Swiss banks subject to a blackmail campaign?
What you've done, and I think you do that in your work sometimes, is you're trying to confuse people, I believe. You throw names around, and I do know my philosophy too. You haven't spoken about the other works written by men such as Rousseau, for example. You've actually named
Such as who?
Rousseau. You've named his polemical work, and of course we could argue that some of Rousseau's influence was appalling, his anti-Semitism, his anti-Christian feeling, the French Revolution and the bloodshed. You've named Marx's polemical work rather than his economic and political philosophy.
I was quoting Das Kapital.
You were quoting the manifesto.
Right, but
it's journalism.
Well, I don't know. It's journalism, which certainly has had a huge impact in political philosophy.
Sure it did. I'm not denying that. We have to rest the calls as soon as we come back. I know it's a busy one. We'll get to more. I don't know, 2 minutes, whatever. See you then. Well, back straight to the calls. Judy on line 5. Hi, Judy.
Hi. How are you?
I'm well.
Okay, I haven't read your book. I will be reading it shortly. But
this man here, not my book, this man here.
Right. My question is, if what you say is true, if there's any credibility in it, what would be the motivation? A. B. How deeply is this entrenched in these organizations? My feeling when I first understood that there were people going after compensation was a nature more of a tort, like to get accountability, like going after Bayer and different people like that, in terms of, as the world, we're looking at these people as having to be responsible for actions that were done. And I think, do you really debate that there are in vaults in Switzerland unmarked funds, artworks, etc., that were taken from victims? And shouldn't there be some sort of organization or some kind of movement to change the possession of those articles and to make the people who took them and where they disappeared accountable? That's one question. And the other thing is that some of these actions, aren't they bringing the whole issue more into the public limelight? And as we see is happening in Europe and even in Toronto, there's more and more actions taken against Jewish people. And this kind of thing has to be stopped. I mean, okay. And people have to be, All
right, let me stop you. Very, very good question. Let's do the first one first, if we may.
Okay. First of all, let me be absolutely clear. I am in favor of compensation. I think victims should be compensated for the suffering that was inflicted on them. But that's not the issue here. The issue is whether claims were being made against the Swiss banks which were flat out fraudulent. And secondly, whether the victims were actually getting the compensation money in the end. Like yourself, I actually didn't even follow the Swiss bank's shakedown as it was unfolding. Because like many people, decent, humane people, on the one side you see fat Swiss bankers or Nazi German industrialists. On the other side you see needy Holocaust victims. And it's not a difficult call. Of course, you're going to side with the victims against the Swiss bankers and the German industrialists, the Nazi German industrialists. So like yourself, I actually supported it when I was first giving it only a glancing attention. It was only when I began to investigate the subject, read through the congressional record, and read through other relevant documents, that it became strikingly apparent that this was simply a blackmail racket. And now you have to ask yourself the question. Some people say, Norman, you're a person on the left. Politically, in fact, you may be said to be on the extreme left. What are you doing defending Swiss bankers, German industrialists? And my answer is very simple. I don't think the Nazi Holocaust should be used in a shakedown racket. I think that memory deserves better. And on the practical level, the fact is that these shakedown rackets, these blackmail schemes, are evoking anti-Semitism throughout Europe. Regrettably, the charges that are being leveled mostly in private against these Jewish organizations, the charges are true. The evidence is now overwhelming on that count. I don't want to go into the details. This is plainly not the place. But there was a $500 million audit conducted on the Swiss banks. It was organized by Paul Volcker, the former head of the Federal Reserve in the United States. The investigative committee consisted of Israelis, American Jews, and Swiss bankers. Well, what were its conclusions? It found that, quote, there is no evidence that the Swiss banks systematically denied Jewish Holocaust victims and their heirs access to the Swiss banks. The main charge of the World Jewish Congress was a fraud. Number two, the Volcker Committee found that, quote, there was no evidence that the Swiss banks destroyed documents to cover their tracks. The second main charge of the World Jewish Congress was a flat-out fraud. Now, they've been doing investigation. How much money is in the banks that belong to Jewish Holocaust survivors? The World Jewish Congress and its cronies said $7 to $20 billion. They extracted from the Swiss $1.25 billion. Do you know how much money has been found to date? $14 million. It was all a colossal hoax.
I have to say, and I read the book. It's not a long book.
No.
What is it, 20,000 words?
I didn't do a word count.
Okay. I mean, that's the length of a thesis. Mm-hmm. I find there's pretty much one or two ideas in it. Mm-hmm. And you've spoken about the Swiss banks, and I'm not an expert in what happened there. Mm-hmm. It's a pretty small part of the overall compensation campaign.
Correct. And
the compensation campaign is a very small part of the entire Holocaust debate, if you like. Mm-hmm. So let's say that till we get back, because we've only got a few seconds.
They have little lanterns sailing down the river, and then they release a flock of doves. Yeah. That reveals sensitivity.
Oh, please.
I think so.
Sir, I'm from Britain. My I have an uncle who is still waiting for compensation for being tortured half to death in a Japanese camp. The Japanese
about their own tragedy.
Yes, but
I'm not saying how they treat others.
But
their
you see,
own tragedy.
with due respect, bad history. The Japanese Hiroshima was appalling. The reason there were two bombs is because after the first one, the Japanese government in Tokyo refused to surrender. But they have the Japanese government, not the people, has used that tragedy to get away with the guilt they shoulder for the terrible torture of British, Dutch, Chinese, Korean, American.
I'm not going to deny that. I was referring to the sensitivity they display to their own tragedy.
I wonder if it is. I wonder if it's sensitivity or something. And we could talk about compensation there, because as you know, that there are men who've died in poverty who just simply wanted a little bit of compensation or acknowledgement.
I'm for compensation.
You know. Let's go to some more calls. Let's go to Erica on line 6. Hello, Erica.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Good. I just wanted to say, you sort of took the words out of my mouth just a while ago when you said that in as far as shows about the Holocaust and movies and Movie of the Week and documentary winning and, you know, Academy Award winners, it is getting a bit tiresome, and it's like, oh, here we go again, another show about the Holocaust. And but the thing is, at the same time in the world, we've got all these other issues going on that are just treated as day-to-day news, and you know, we forget about all the other stuff because, oh, Jesus, it's a Movie of the Week about the Holocaust.
Well, Erica, that's not what I said at all. And again, you've got to be very careful when speaking about an issue as sensitive as this. I said that the great movies and great books about the Holocaust are wonderful, but there's too much third-rate mediocrity stuff just to fill time, and I think that shames. But what you've just done is a very good example. You've said no one cares about the other issues because there's another movie about the Holocaust. You've mixed a color with a shape, as it were. We don't not talk about certain issues because we talk about the Holocaust instead. We don't talk about certain issues because we're not a fair and just world. We don't talk about, say, suffering in the developing world because we'd rather raise money for little kittens and puppies because they look cute on TV. For goodness sake, don't use the Holocaust as that isn't the reason for the injustice and lack of media coverage of events in the world.
Yes, but I do think as your caller suggests, there is a problem with the amount of investment that's been made in this film, scholarship, and so on in the Nazi Holocaust versus the investment that's been made in other fields. As I pointed out in I'll give a very simple example. As some of your viewers may be aware, between 1891 and 1911, approximately 10 to 15 million Belgian Congolese in the Belgian Congo were killed in the course of Belgium's exploitation of the Congo's rubber and ivory resources. Now, 10 to 15 million people is plainly not a trivial number. It's roughly the number that were killed in all of World War I. Now, would you believe that in the English language, there is exactly one scholarly study on what came out a couple of years ago. It was called, by Adam Hochschild. The name will come to me in a moment. Just give me a half second. But there's one study on the Nazi Holocaust. The conservative figure is 10,000.
You don't know anything about me, nor should you, but you do know I wrote a major biography of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. You're aware of that?
Yeah, and I know Arthur Conan Doyle was one of the individuals who called, incidentally, what happened in the what happened in the Belgian Congo. He said it was the most ghastly crime in the history of humankind.
I've read more than one book about what happened. Just simply wrong.
No. In the English language, King Leopold's Ghost. In the English language, I can assure you, because I've written on the topic and I've read everything on the subject. In the English language...
I'll lend you the book.
No, the only scholarly study was written by Adam Hochschild, King Leopold's Ghost, 2 years ago. There were...
That's the most recent.
There were, at the time, there was a huge international campaign initiated by E.D. Morrill, and one of the people who he recruited was Arthur Conan Doyle, and he wrote his first-hand journalistic accounts of what was happening in the early part of the 20th.
Well, that's straight to the calls. Judy on line 5. Hi, Judy.
Hi. How are you?
I'm well.
Okay, I haven't read your book. I will be reading it shortly. But
this man here, not my book, this man here.
Yeah, right. My question is, if what you say is true, if there's any credibility in it, what would be the motivation? A. B. How deeply is this entrenched in these organizations? My feeling when I first understood that there were people going after compensation was a nature more of a tort, like to get accountability, like going after Bayer and different people like that, in terms of, as the world, we're looking at these people as having to be responsible for actions that were done. And I think, do you really debate that there are in vaults in Switzerland unmarked funds, artworks, etc., that were taken from victims, and shouldn't there be some sort of organization or some kind of movement to change the possession of those articles and to make the people who took them and where they disappeared accountable? That's one question. And the other thing is that some of these actions, aren't they bringing the whole issue more into the public limelight? And as we see is happening in Europe and even in Toronto, there's more and more actions taken against Jewish people. And this kind of thing has to be stopped. I mean, and people have to be,
All right, let me stop you. Very, very good question. Let's do the first one first, if we may.
Okay. First of all, let me be absolutely clear. I am in favor of compensation. I think victims should be compensated for the suffering that was inflicted on them. But that's not the issue here. The issue is whether claims were being made against the Swiss banks which were flat out fraudulent. And secondly, whether the victims were actually getting the compensation money in the end. Like yourself, I actually didn't even follow the Swiss bank's shakedown as it was unfolding. Because like many people, decent, humane people, On the one side, you see fat Swiss bankers or Nazi German industrialists. On the other side, you see needy Holocaust victims. And it's not a difficult call. Of course, you're going to side with the victims against the Swiss bankers and the German industrialists, the Nazi German industrialists. So like yourself, I actually supported it when I was first giving it only a glancing attention. It was only when I began to investigate the subject, read through the congressional record, and read through other relevant documents, that it became strikingly apparent that this was simply a blackmail racket. And now you have to ask yourself the question. Some people say, Norman, you're a person on the left. Politically, in fact, you may be said to be on the extreme left. What are you doing defending Swiss bankers, German industrialists? And my answer is very simple. I don't think the Nazi Holocaust should be used in a shakedown racket. I think that memory deserves better. And on the practical level, the fact is that these shakedown rackets, these blackmail schemes, are evoking anti-Semitism throughout Europe. Regrettably, the charges that are being leveled mostly in private against these Jewish organizations, the charges are true. The evidence is now overwhelming on that count. I don't want to go into the details. This is plainly not the place. But there was a $500 million audit conducted on the Swiss banks. It was organized by Paul Volcker, the former head of the Federal Reserve in the United States. The investigative committee consisted of Israelis, American Jews, and Swiss bankers. Well, what were its conclusions? It found that, quote, there is no evidence that the Swiss banks systematically denied Jewish Holocaust victims and their heirs access to the Swiss banks. The main charge of the World Jewish Congress was a fraud. Number two, the Volcker Committee found that, quote, there was no evidence that the Swiss banks destroyed documents to cover their tracks. The second main charge of the World Jewish Congress was a flat-out fraud. Now, they've been doing investigation. How much money is in the banks that belong to Jewish Holocaust survivors? The World Jewish Congress and its cronies said $7 to $20 billion. They extracted from the Swiss $1.25 billion. Do you know how much money has been found to date? $14 million. It was all a colossal hoax.
I have to say, and I read the book. It's not a long book.
No.
What is it, 20,000 words?
I didn't do a word count.
Okay. I mean, that's the length of a thesis. Mm-hmm. I find there's pretty much one or two ideas in it. Mm-hmm. And you've spoken about the Swiss banks, and I'm not an expert in what happened there. Mm-hmm. It's a pretty small part of the overall compensation campaign.
Correct. And
the compensation campaign is a very small part of the entire Holocaust debate, if you like. Mm-hmm. So let's save that till we get back, because we've only got a few seconds.